Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time Rosecrans was defeated at the Battle of Chickamauga. Now we join him as he sits with the Army of the Cumberland at Chattanooga, and follow him as he is relieved as commander of that army. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. In Chattanooga, Rosecrans began preparing for his troops to come to Rossville and Rossville Gap. He sent an aide to George Thomas, still holding his ground on Snodgrass Hill and around Kelly Field, earning him the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga. The dispatch said, "Assume command of all the forces, and with Crittenden and McCook, take a strong position and assume a threatening attitude at Rossville. Send all the unorganized forces to this place for reorganization. I will examine the ground here and make such dispositions for defense as the case may require and join you. Have sent out ammunition with rations." As Rosecrans set about reorganizing his army and preparing for a defensive stand at Rossville Gap, Washington was already aware of the disaster. Charles A. Dana, the observer and spy for Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, telegraphed Washington at 4 p.m. that, "My report today is of deplorable importance. Chickamauga is as fatal a name in our history as Bull Run. It was wholesale panic. Enemy not yet arrived before Chattanooga. Preparations making to resist his entrance for a time." Although Dana sent the message in code, the code was broken by a telegraph operator in Nashville, and word began to spread far and wide about the defeat at Chickamauga. At 5 p.m., Rosecrans received word from James Garfield, who traveled to Thomas still on the battlefield. It read, "General Thomas has Brannan's, Baird's, Reynolds', Wood's, Palmer's, and Johnson's divisions still intact after terrible fighting. Granger is here closed up with Thomas and is fighting terribly on the right. Sheridan is in with the bulk of his division, but in ragged shape, though plucky and fighting. I hope General Thomas will be able to hold on here till night, and will not need to fall back farther than Rossville. Perhaps not any. I think we may in the main retrieve our morning disaster. I never saw better fighting than our men are now doing. Granger thinks we can defeat them badly tomorrow if all our forces come in. I think you had better come to Rossville tonight and bring ammunition." At 8 p.m., Dana sent another message to Washington. It read, "I am happy to report that my dispatch at 4 p.m. today proves to have given too dark a view of our disaster. Having been myself swept off the battlefield, my own impressions were naturally colored by the aspects of that part of the field. Some gentlemen of Rosecrans' staff say Chickamauga is not very much worse than was Murfreesboro. I can testify to the conspicuous and steady gallantry of Rosecrans on the field. He made all possible efforts to rally the broken columns. Nor do I say that there was any fault in the disposition of his forces. The disaster might perhaps have been averted but for the blunder of McCook in marching back from his previous advanced position. That blunder cost us 4 days of precious time." Despite this brighter report from Dana, the damage to Rosecrans' reputation had already been done. Newspapers were carrying the story of the horrible defeat at Chickamauga, and the people's minds were turning against Rosecrans. Word came to Rosecrans from Garfield about Thomas successfully throwing back repeated Confederate assaults, and reported that the day hadn't been a total loss. Garfield suggested that Rosecrans bring all the forces available back to Chickamauga and renew the fight in the morning. Rosecrans responded, "Thank God. This is good enough. The day isn't lost yet. Gentlemen, this is no place for you. Go at once to your commands at the front." Gordon Granger convinced Rosecrans to order Thomas to retire from the field and come to Rossville. At 12:35 a.m. on September 21st, Rosecrans received word from Abraham Lincoln. It read, "Be of good cheer. We have unabated confidence in you and in your soldiers and officers. In the main, you must be the judge of what is to be done. If I was to suggest, I would say save your army by taking strong positions until Burnside joins you, when I hope you can turn the tide. I think you had better send a courier to Burnside to hurry him up. We cannot reach him by telegraph. We suppose some force is going to you from Corinth, but for want of communications we do not know how they are getting along. We shall do our utmost to assist you. Send us your present postings." Rosecrans reported to General-in-Chief Henry Halleck, "Enemy confronts us, but we have taken the starch out of him." The Army of the Cumberland moved to Chattanooga and began throwing up entrenchments to resist an attack by Confederate forces. The men labored to keep a grip on the vital railroad hub, and Washington began sending reinforcements to Rosecrans, 2 corps from the Army of the Potomac and troops from the Army of the Tennessee. Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs visited Chattanooga and remarked, "I have seen the men vigorous, hardy, cheerful, and confident. The position is very strong already, and rapidly approaching a perfect security against assault. Nothing but a regular siege could, I think, reduce it." During the Army's stay in Chattanooga, Rosecrans, along with the help of his medical director, created a hospital car for the railroad by converting the day coach seats to beds. He also worked to open up a supply line out of the city. It was a windy mountain road, but it would allow a trickle of supplies to get in, but help needed to get there quickly. In early October, Rosecrans expected about 800 wagons of provisions to come to the city over the rough roads. However, the more numerous Confederate cavalry struck the wagon train, destroying at least half of the wagons full of supplies and slaughtering hundreds of the mules pulling those wagons. Rosecrans's army's 10 days' rations were coming to an end, and this disaster only added to Rosecrans's woes and his standing in the eyes of the Lincoln administration. On October 5th, the Confederate artillery posted on Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge began shelling the Union garrison. Since Burnside entered East Tennessee, Rosecrans attempted to get Burnside to come to his assistance. Burnside sent a message to Rosecrans asking if there was any truth in the reports that Confederate cavalry were crossing the Tennessee River. Rosecrans lashed out in his own message saying, "Having warned you often of the danger for the last 10 days, and reported the catastrophe to you on the 1st, and got your promise to send your cavalry to help mine, I am amazed at your dispatch. I now say that your failure to close your troops down on our left has cost 500 wagons loaded with essentials, the post of McMinnville, and heaven only knows where the mischief will end. If you don't unite with us soon, you will be responsible for another catastrophe, I fear." Rosecrans sent another message, but this one went to Abraham Lincoln, and some believed it helped lead to his removal as Army commander. It said, "If we maintain the position in such strength that the enemy are obliged to abandon their position, and the elections of the great states go favorably, would it not be well to offer a general amnesty to all officers and soldiers in the rebellion? It would give us moral strength, and weaken them very much." Rosecrans' thinking was based on the fact that his army encountered innumerable deserters from the Confederate lines. He thought that if Lincoln offered amnesty, then more would desert and surrender themselves. It appears Lincoln didn't take offense to it, but Edwin Stanton did, even accusing Rosecrans of wanting an armistice and peace terms. Add on to that, Charles Dana soured on Rosecrans, as well as other corps commanders within the army, specifically Alexander McCook and Thomas Crittenden. Rosecrans didn't have a lot of trust in their ability to command on the field. Dana would write to the War Department, "The defects of Rosecrans's character complicate the difficulty. He abounds in friendliness and approbativeness, and is greatly lacking in firmness and steadiness of will. He is a temporizing man, dreads so heavy an alternative as is now presented, and hates to break with McCook and Crittenden. Besides, there is a more serious obstacle to his acting decisively in the fact that if McCook and Crittenden fled to Chattanooga, he fled also. And it may be said in his excuse that, under the circumstances, although it was proper for the commanding general to go to his base of operations, while corps commanders ought to remain with their troops, still he feels that that excuse cannot entirely clear him, either in his own eyes or those of the army. While the subordinate commanders will not resign if he is retained in the chief command, their respect for him as a general has received an irreparable blow. If it be decided to change the chief commander also, I would take the liberty of suggesting that some Western general of high rank and great prestige, like Grant for instance, would be preferable as his successor to anyone who has commanded in the East alone." The next day, McCook and Crittenden were removed from their position, and a court of inquiry called to get to the bottom of their actions. Dana's words had a powerful impact on the Army of the Cumberland. Edwin Stanton sent word to Dana that, "I wish you to go directly to see General Thomas and say to him that his services, his abilities, his character, his unselfishness have always been most cordially appreciated by me, and that it is not my fault that he has not long since had command of an independent army." Dana brought the word to Thomas, who said, "I would not like to take command of an army where I should be exposed to the imputation of having intrigued, or of having exercised any effort to supplant my previous commander." Thomas wrote to Rosecrans, "I asked General Garfield to speak to you about the traitors from Washington now in camp, and I want now to tell you that I should consider your removal from this army a national injury. Should it be done, I will no longer serve with it, but asked to be relieved and sent elsewhere. Rosecrans responded, "Of this be sure, no cloud shall ever come between us." The supply problem at Chattanooga was being worked out, but slowly. A steamboat named the Chattanooga was being finished, and a plan to carry supplies by water most of the way up the Tennessee, then come overland over the bends in the river to the city was being worked out. All that was needed to open up this supply line was to capture Brown's Ferry and set up a pontoon bridge. On October 19th, Rosecrans and the engineer William Baldy Smith went out on the river to examine the locations. A message came to headquarters. Gordon Granger read it and laid it on Rosecrans's desk. When old Rosie returned, he found that he had been relieved, and George Thomas was to take command of the Army of the Cumberland. Rosecrans was in a happy spirit and called for Thomas to come to his headquarters. Rosecrans handed Thomas the dispatch, and the Rock of Chickamauga read it in silence. Thomas reminded his friend what he said weeks ago. Rosecrans stopped him and said, "George, we are in the face of the enemy. No one but you can safely take my place now, and for our country's sake you must do it. Don't fear, no cloud of doubt will ever come into my mind as to your fidelity to friendship and honor." Thomas accepted the command by displaying silence. Until about midnight, Thomas and Rosecrans talked about the entire plan to open up Lookout Valley in order to establish a stable supply line into the city. Rosecrans informed the new commanding general that he would leave about 5 a.m. that morning, before Thomas read Rosecrans's official statement to the troops. Rosecrans was to head to Cincinnati and await further orders. He got to Stevenson, Alabama, and found Ulysses S. Grant there, the now overall commander of forces in the West. Rosecrans came into his train car, and we held a brief interview in which he described very clearly the situation at Chattanooga, and made some excellent suggestions as to what should be done. My only wonder was that he had not carried them out, Grant stated. The North was divided by Rosecrans's removal. Some hated to see the general go because of his past victories, and some were happy that Grant was now commanding all the forces in the West. One newspaper responded to the news that Rosecrans was no longer in command by saying, "There is wailing and weeping in the Army of the Cumberland today. They slew him with poison, whom they feared to meet with steel. Already the maggots are active on the carcass of the fallen lion." A Confederate newspaper wrote, "Lincoln is helping us. He has removed from command the most dangerous man in his army. Rosecrans, thus retired, is unquestionably the greatest captain the Yankee nation has yet produced." Rosecrans remained at Cincinnati for weeks, awaiting his next assignment. Many generals who fell out of favor were sent away and given no further commands, or sent to locations where little action remained. His assignment was dated January 28, 1864, and he was to become commander in Missouri, to replace John M. Schofield in that position. Schofield would head eastward, first to East Tennessee to combat Confederate General James Longstreet, then command the Army of the Ohio in the Atlanta campaign. Rosecrans arrived in St. Louis on January 29th and left the next day for Nashville, Tennessee, to be a part of the Court of Inquiry for Alexander McCook, Thomas Crittenden, and James Negley. The Court of Inquiry didn't censure any of the men, and Rosecrans returned to St. Louis to take care of his new department. St. Louis was a major depot of supplies for armies in the Western Theater and the Trans-Mississippi Theater, so its protection was necessary, but Rosecrans took command of about 17,000 soldiers present for duty to protect the entire state of Missouri. 42 pieces of artillery was also available to him, but they were needed to protect St. Louis and couldn't be used on a campaign. Further hindering Rosecrans was the fact that he was being stripped of troops. Soon after arriving, he was ordered to send thousands of soldiers to Mississippi from his command. Rosecrans had run-ins with the War Department as commander in Missouri. Colonel John Sanderson, Rosecrans's provost marshal general, was doing an excellent job, according to Rosecrans. So old Rosie requested a promotion to brigadier general for the faithful officer. The War Department turned the request down. To plead his case, Rosecrans sent his aide, Frank Bond, to the War Department. The department arrested him on the grounds that an officer on leave of absence wasn't allowed to enter the capital. Bond was sent back to Missouri for trial, and Rosecrans, as hand-appointed court-martial, found the man not guilty. A group of Missouri militia with questionable loyalty known as Pawpaws were at least partially in cahoots with the Order of American Knights. This group hoped to take over the state of Missouri to swing the election against Abraham Lincoln. Plus, they wanted to liberate the prisoner of war camps in the North. In all reality, the Knights didn't have enough power to do all they planned, and the fact that Rosecrans found out the plan and publicized it kept the plan from coming to fruition. To add further humiliation to Rosecrans, the War Department created the West Mississippi Division, within which Missouri resided. A message was sent to Rosecrans informing him that the commander of this military division was General Edward Canby, and that Rosie would answer to him. As the Overland Campaign in Virginia and the Atlanta Campaign in Georgia began to raise the casualties of the Union armies, especially in Virginia, Grant needed more troops for those operations and began stripping them away from garrisons elsewhere. A rising guerrillas prompted Rosecrans to call for more troops to deal with them, having only about 4 regiments and some cavalry to protect the entire state. When Grant was informed of Rosecrans and some other generals' calls for troops, he responded, "I am satisfied that you would hear the same call if they were stationed in Maine. Rosecrans should be removed and someone else placed in command. It makes but little difference who you assign. It would be an improvement." When the presidential convention came together to nominate the Republican or National Union Party ticket, the party wanted to change Lincoln's vice president and wanted a war Democrat to help ensure victory. James Garfield sent a message to Rosecrans asking if he would like to be considered. Rosecrans responded in a confusing but accepting message, but the message never made it to Garfield. One of Rosecrans's biographers hypothesized that Edwin Stanton intercepted the message. In the end, Andrew Johnson was named Lincoln's vice president. In the fall of 1864, Confederate General Sterling Price launched his invasion of Missouri. Rosecrans called for troops to enlist in 11 regiments. 5 regiments had been recruited by the time Price crossed into Missouri from Arkansas. A small Union force of about 1,500 men threw back a Confederate force 5 to 6 times larger than its own at the Battle of Fort Davidson, buying Rosecrans some time. Instead of attacking St. Louis, Price began moving toward Jefferson City, and Union forces nipped at his heels, Rosecrans not daring to launch an offensive being so outnumbered. 3 Union contingents converged on Price's army: Rosecrans, Samuel Curtis from Kansas, and James Blunt from Arkansas. Rosecrans wanted to trap Price and utterly destroy his army. Price fought Curtis at Independence, Missouri, and the rebel commander began to fall back toward Arkansas. Rosecrans began his pursuit, but he failed to report this to the other commanders or the War Department. Thus, it looked to them that he had abandoned the pursuit. By early November, Price was below the Arkansas River. Curtis was placed in charge of the Missouri troops going after Price, and Rosecrans returned to St. Louis to watch over the elections that he believed the Knights were going to threaten. The Knights didn't rise up, and the election went off without a hitch. Grant, suspecting Rosecrans of withholding troops from being sent to him, sent John Rawlins, his obedient staffer, to sniff out any troops that Rosecrans might be hiding. Rawlins informed Grant that Rosecrans sent all the available forces under his command. By December of 1864, Grant had had enough of Rosecrans's call for troops. Henry Halleck asked Grant, "Where shall Rosecrans be sent by the order placing General Grenville Dodge, commander of the Department of the Missouri?" Grant replied, "Rosecrans will do less harm doing nothing than on duty. I know no department or commander deserving such punishment as the infliction of Rosecrans on them." By mid-December, Rosecrans was removed from the command. He reflected on his removal, stating, "Thus a second time rewarded for fidelity and untiring devotion to the cause of the nation and the interest of my command, unsustained by a single act of insubordination or intrigue or malevolence in all my military career, and thank God without ever having suffered defeat or made a failure in a single great undertaking. I retired to my home, where for the country's sake I have submitted to my wrongs without a public complaint." He also wrote, "Without warning, notice, or complaint, or hint of explanation, I am removed and put in an attitude of disgrace before the nation. Isn't it strange? You know I consider my present situation an outrage on justice having few parallels in this or any other war. But I am a firm believer in the final downfall of iniquity." The war came to an end the next year, and Rosecrans sat in Cincinnati, finally resigning from the army in December of 1865. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, states and politicians begged him to run for political office, but he declined them all. He would get the nickname the Great Decliner. In the post-war years, Rosecrans attempted many business ventures, mostly dealing with railroads, but he did purchase land in California to establish a mine. He had to search for business elsewhere because his business partners at the refinery in Cincinnati froze him out of their accounts. He helped incorporate the Southern Pacific Railroad and became its chief engineer. However, as one of his biographers explained, His greatest losses were his Southern Pacific holdings. The completion of the Union Pacific made these very valuable, and distrusting certain associates, he hired a judge to scrutinize every newspaper of regular issue during his frequent absences from California. Financiers controlling the company levied a small assessment against Southern Pacific's capital stock in a campaign to freeze Rosecrans out, and advertised the levy in an obscure weekly paper with fewer than 200 subscribers. The judge, who had been hired as a watchdog, failed to see the item. Rosecrans failed to pay the levy, and his stock was secretly auctioned off. To discourage Rosecrans from carrying the case through the courts, squatters were put on his California land. Rosecrans cleared his title, but he lost his railroad stock. In 1868, President Andrew Johnson made Rosecrans the minister to Mexico, but 5 months later, Ulysses S. Grant removed him from that position. Rosecrans, in his 5 months, encouraged railroad building in Mexico to make it prosperous and tied economically with the United States. In 1870, upon the death of his dear friend George Thomas, Rosecrans was one of the pallbearers for the Rock of Chickamauga, a group of men that included George Meade, William B. Hazen, Joseph Hooker, and Gordon Granger. In the late 1870s, in rapid succession, his son Louis, daughter Mary, brother Sylvester, and his wife Annie passed away, leaving the old general distraught over their losses. He rarely spoke of his wife after her death, the pain too much for him. In 1880, Rosecrans ran for a congressional seat in California's 1st District, and his former aide, James A. Garfield, ran for president. Garfield as a Republican and Rosecrans as a Democrat. Bad blood had formed between the two best friends as word of a letter written about Rosecrans to Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase became public knowledge. The letter was dated before the Battle of Chickamauga, but it criticized Rosecrans, and some people believed it had a great deal to do with Rosecrans's removal as commander of the Army of the Cumberland. The two men never mended their friendship. Garfield would die the next year from an assassin's bullet. Rosecrans won his election and was re-elected in 1882. During this term, he took part in his most famous move as a politician. Ulysses S. Grant was bankrupt. He had lost his money in ventures, particularly his son's business on Wall Street, and needed money. Congress supported a retirement bill to give Grant funds, specifically restore his lieutenant general's rank and backdate his pay to 1869. Rosecrans opposed the bill, stating that the bill was a proposition to reward Grant for his distinguished military service, and he said he could not vote for it because when true history is written, that service will be pared down to very different dimensions. His opposition, Rosecrans maintained, was not due to personal dislike or to the fact that Grant had made official statements that were false and which he knew to be false at the time he made them, and which I have shown in my official reports to be false. I cannot say to the people of this country that a business which has been conducted as to rob poor people of millions, and which, if done on a smaller scale, would have sent its managers to prison, shall be considered as important when the principal manager has allowed a great name to be used as the instrument of the robbery. The bill would ultimately pass. In 1884, under President Grover Cleveland, Rosecrans was appointed Registrar of the Treasury. He held other titles as well, a Regent of the University of California, a member of the board of the Chickamauga Battlefield Commission, and Georgetown University awarded him an honorary doctorate of law. In his old age, Rosecrans cared little for accumulating wealth. One day, a homeless man knocked on his hotel room door looking for some money, and Rosecrans gave him his collection of gold coins given to him by Mexican President Porfirio Diaz. If a veteran came to him asking for a meal and the general didn't have any cash on him, he would take the man to the Willard Hotel in Washington and put the meal on his tab. Congress wanted to restore Rosecrans's rank and put him on the retired list, which would give him some more income. Many in Congress disagreed with giving him that luxury, pointing to his opposition to Grant's bill. A veteran from Corinth, elected to Congress from Iowa, got up before the Congressional Assembly as a Republican and stated that when justice to a soldier was involved, he knew no politics. Another spoke out, "We can afford to forget what Rosecrans may have said. We cannot afford to forget what he did." The bill passed on February 22, 1889. In 1892, at a meeting of the Grand Army of the Republic in Washington, Rosecrans rose to speak, but was too feeble to speak loudly. The lights had gone out, and it was dim in the tent. A man from the crowd yelled that they wanted to see his face. Former President Rutherford B. Hayes struck a match and held it to the old general's face to illuminate it, and the tent roared with applause. Later that year, Rosecrans left the Treasury to spend his last remaining years in California. His son Carl took over the California land and became concerned over his father's propensity to leave on horseback for an hour's ride and not return for 2 days, so he hired an African-American man named Charles to watch after him. Old Rosie loved his grandchildren, playing with them as much as he could and telling them stories about the war and his horse Boney. Rosecrans had always loved animals, but especially horses and dogs. Rosecrans would catch pneumonia but seemed to fight out of it, but when he found out that one of his grandchildren had passed away from diphtheria, he started to backslide. On March 11, 1898, William Stark Rosecrans passed away. His body laid in state in Los Angeles at the City Hall with his headquarters flag, the same one that flew over his headquarters at Stones River in Chickamauga, draped over his coffin. He would be placed in a receiving vault in Los Angeles. In 1908, surrounded by President Theodore Roosevelt and numerous Union and Confederate veterans, the general was laid to rest in Arlington Cemetery. Major General William Stark Rosecrans lived a fairly successful life, having produced numerous inventions, developed businesses, and rose to command one of the preeminent armies of the American Civil War. His early successes in Western Virginia and Corinth set him up to command the Army of the Cumberland. His efforts at the Battle of Stones River ultimately winning a victory, the first one after the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was issued, helped the Union not only militarily but politically. Although his superiors saw his inactivity as timidness or laziness, Rosecrans didn't move until he was ready, and when he did so deliberately, i.e. the Tullahoma Campaign. He constantly butted heads with Ulysses S. Grant and the War Department, which produced great animosity and ultimately cost him command of the Army of the Cumberland after the defeat at Chickamauga. However, Rosecrans needs to be remembered as a stern disciplinarian who whipped the Army of the Cumberland into shape, helped create the modern state of West Virginia, gave Lincoln a needed victory in January 1863, developed numerous inventions to help soldiers, and masterfully wrestled Middle Tennessee from Confederate hands through maneuvers and minutely tiny amounts of bloodshed. Chickamauga was an aberration in his military career. He succeeded far more than he failed. In June 1864, in a moment of prophetic vision, General Gordon Granger had written to Rosecrans, "The battle is neither to the swift nor to the strong, but to him that holds on to the end. If Grant and Sherman squelch out the rebellion, they will be heroes and we will be forgotten. So let it be, provided we are once more a happy, united people." Partly due to circumstances beyond his control, partly to something within himself, it was Rosecrans's lot not to be able to hold on to the end. But he came close. He touched the edge of glory.